Well, let's get going.
That
Let's
sounds
get
fine.
let's get going because it's a storm is brewing here, and when that
Uh-oh.
happens, I tend to lose power. So
Oh dear.
yeah,
Well,
I
we
live
just
out in
had
the
tornadoes go through Tallahassee, so
yeah. Well, it's been like that all day off and on here, and I live out in the boonies, and the service is not great even on a sunny day. So let's get moving.
okay, hold on one second. Is Jeff Mitchum in the
Yeah,
audience?
I'm going to introduce you, Brent.
Oh, oh,
I've known
okay.
Brent Weisman for many years. We were both graduate students of Jerry Milano at the University of Florida.
Okay, Jeff, if you could move a little closer to the computer so we can hear you.
Okay.
Thank you.
But anyway, Brent and I got to know each other when we both had office and lab space in the Florida Museum of Natural History. And he was doing research around the Withlacoochee River area. And I started working with him out there. And he did a lot of really interesting research. He actually he located the campsite of Osceola that had just been abandoned during the Second Seminole War. It was called Powellstown.
Jeff, we can't hear you.
Okay, well, I'm yelling as loud as I can. Everybody here can hear me, so I don't know. But anyway,
No, the computer audience can't hear you. I know the people there can hear you. Sorry. Our speaker can't hear you.
That's okay.
But anyway, he not only found Osceola's abandoned campsite, and it was definitely proven to be that, he also discovered the Tatham Mound that I talked to you about a year ago or so, or whenever it was. And I actually wrote half of my dissertation on that site. He later went on to work for the coral program and went all over the state and worked at different sites and did all kinds of excavations and recording of sites. He's done a number of books on the mission site at Ichtuckney Springs, also at Crystal River, and he's done a couple of books on the Seminole tribe and different archaeological aspects of them. Tonight, he's going to be talking about Indian Key, which is a really fantastic place. It's an island in the Keys, and it was owned at one time by a man named Henry Perrine, which you'll hear a lot about. And a lot of really interesting stuff has happened there. And I'm really happy that the state has now sort of made it accessible to visitors. For many years it wasn't. But with that, I will turn it over. Oh, and Brent also went on to become a professor at the University of South Florida, taught there for many years and directed a lot of students, and ultimately became a dean before he retired a few years ago. So with that, I turn it over to my old friend, Brent Weisman.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. That was very generous and gracious and took me down memory lane. And hope I don't get stuck there. So, but actually, let's advance to our first slide, if you can do that, beyond the title. Yes. So the last time, and I want to thank Past and Marie for inviting me back. I think this is my third presentation for the group, and I enjoy talking to Past. It's a very good, very informed group, and they show a lot of interest in what I've done over the years. Last time I talked, it was maybe 2 years ago, on the Ichtuckney Fig Springs mission, the Spanish mission that was occupied in the early 1600s on the banks of the Ichtuckney River, not too far south of Tallahassee. Tonight we're going way down south, down to the Florida Keys. On a good day, it's an 8.5-hour drive from Tallahassee, probably more like 9 hours to get to Isla Mirada, which is in the Upper Keys. That same distance, if you went north, you'd be somewhere in West Virginia, just to give you an idea of distance here. And when you get down to the Keys, you may as well be in West Virginia because it's like a very different state of mind. And so it's a long ways down there. It's very different. You see it there marked on the map in front of you with the boat with the sails. That's the approximate location of Indian Key, in between Upper Matacumbe and Lower Matacumbe. And there's, for those of you Florida archaeology fans, right as you pass over the bridge, Indian Key Pass between Upper and Lower Matacumbe, off to your right, back in the mangroves, is the John Goggin Upper Matacumbe site, which is where he did his work many years ago in the 1940s and set really the ceramic stratigraphy for the Everglades in South Florida. Okay, let's move on, please. As you cross the bridge over Indian Key Pass between Upper and Lower, you look out to your left about a mile out on the ocean, and there is Indian Key, which is about an 11-acre chunk of coral rock sticking up out of the ocean, and 11 acres at high tide permitting. Highest elevation is about 11 feet above sea level. Hurricane and storm surge permitting. Has been many times demonstrated by the archaeological record and a documentary record that has been underwater, overcome by hurricane surges. Next one, please. This is an aerial view of Indian Key taken after the Park Service took over the island in 1970 and had some very good archaeology, which I'll talk about in a moment, by an excellent archaeologist. Preliminary work was done by Henry Baker, who worked for BAR back in the day. And his job was to find out if anything remained of the main structures on Indian Key and the town plan, if it existed. Could he find it? Could he lay it out in a very basic way for the Park Service so that they could start some kind of interpretation of the island for the public? There you see what you're going to see in the next couple of images. The big town square in the middle and the pattern of street alignments that you see going diagonally across your screen. Before I go further, I want to make sure, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yes? Yes, okay. Okay. Next slide, please. So here we see a map of Indian Key done at the time, back in the 1830s. This was done as a promotional map. You see the basic alignment of streets that we saw in the previous image. The town square kind of in the lower center there. And Indian Key was being promoted as a resort, as an investment opportunity. This is back, remember, in the 1830s now. So long before we think about Florida as a resort destination. The Seminole War was about ready to start, had not quite started yet. And it was one of the first buildings there was a place called the Tropical Hotel. It had advertisements in the New York papers, the Charleston papers. Come on down and enjoy the tropical breezes and the sun and the fishing. Come on down to Indian Key. And what we see there are the street alignments, the individual lots laid out, the docks and wharfs in the right-hand corner that were where the boats would dock, where the commercial operations would take place. And next slide, please. And a artist view, actually not an artist view. This was done by Henry Perrine's child, one of his children. And from memory, when he visited the site many years later, here you see basically the same, the town square, the arrangement of the town lots, the wharfs and docks. And what you'll see there is the actually, like what the engineers would call the as-built. In other words, what actually happened as opposed to what the blueprint showed they dreamed to happen. So it's much reduced in its scale and its size, only a few town lots. In the upper left-hand corner, there's a compound owned by Charles Howe. In the right-hand side, the largest building there is the warehouse. We're going to talk a lot about that in a moment. And the two docks. Okay, move on, please. This is an artist's view that shows the sort of a oblique view of the same thing we've been looking at with the docks out front, the wharfs. The warehouse to our left, a 2-story building, 2.5-story building, the Howe compound to our far right, and the street alignments in our center there, just to give you sort of a 3-dimensional view of what it looks like. Okay, next one, please. And I'm moving a little faster than I intended because I see out my window here, the clouds are building. So I want to get moving as far as I can through it in case we get cut off. All right, Indian Key has a historical importance, historical significance. Unfortunately, the Florida Keys, both archaeologically and historically, have not really made it into the mainstream of Florida history or Florida archaeology. Despite its forays into history and the historical importance that it's had, it never really penetrated the mainstream. But here are some of the people that for which it's known. The Perrine children, Jeff mentioned Henry Perrine in his introduction, are the 3 people in the upper left hand there, and another Perrine daughter to the left. And Henry's wife is the profile view to the right. We don't have any reliable image of Henry himself. The bearded gentleman in the lower left is the assistant naval surgeon that was stationed there in the 1840 to 1842. In the upper right is one of the well-known historical personages that lived on Indian Key for a short period. That's Lieutenant John McLaughlin, both famous and infamous, 1840 to 1842 on the Key. The woman holding the infant was known as Aunt Jane. She lived on the island as a child. This is a picture taken with her as an adult, holding one of the Perrine children's children, so it would be Henry's grandchild, much later when they moved to New York. And the center picture and the lower right are the people that actually did the work at Indian Key. The workers, the enslaved people, loading, unloading docks, fishing, providing food for the residents. Next one, please. Now, we also have, in addition to Perrine, we have John Audubon was there in 1832. As he stopped there twice on his tour around the Florida Peninsula. He went down to Key West, around to the Dry Tortugas, and back up to Indian Key. So he stopped there twice. But his importance to us is that he had an artist with him that traveled with him that did the backgrounds for his paintings. You know, if you look at his bird paintings, there's usually some kind of background in there. He had a special artist do that. In this case, we were lucky that the artist, who was a Swiss artist named George Lehman, drew, sketched, and then painted a picture of Indian Key, which you see there in the background. You see the warehouse in 1832. In 1838, we have a census that was done. 47 people lived on Indian Key. 21 of them were white, 26 were black. And another census, which there was a lot of conflict with the censuses because sometimes by the proprietors of the island, we'll talk about more in a moment, were inflated for political reasons. Sometimes sailors or people that were staying in the hotel or staying transients were counted. So another census from the same period shows 98 whites, 29 slaves, and 14 free blacks. Obviously, some very different figures. One person we did not mention when we showed the historical figures was actually came to be the owner of Indian Key, and perhaps its most famous and infamous, Jacob Houseman. And Houseman came down from Staten Island. He stole his father's ship, sailed down to Key West, noticed that the main profitable occupation in Key West was salvaging shipwrecks, but the competition was stiff, and he didn't have an inside lane to get in there. It was very cliquey. So he thought, well, I'm going to go up to Indian Key. It's been slightly settled already. There was a hotel there. I'm going to buy my way into Indian Key piece by piece, set up my own operation, which he did. A salvaging operation, a wrecking operation. There's a reef about a mile or so out in the ocean from Indian Key called Alligator Reef. Ships would wreck there. Of course, the wreckers, the wrecking industry was highly regulated by law, by maritime courts, maritime law, but the wreckers were very good at skirting the laws or causing shipwrecks by placing phantom lights out to, on the reefs themselves so that the ships would sail toward the reef and wreck. But Houseman was extremely skilled at he was a renegade. The wrecking industry wasn't supposed to be piratical, but he was basically a pirate and was often in court defending himself against claims by the ship owners or the ship captains. But it was his dream to establish this thriving settlement at Indian Key. It was his town plan that we saw in that earlier image. And he had slaves there, enslaved people on Indian Key working for him. And he bought up the shares of the key that were owned previously and started to develop. He improved on the warehouse that we saw. And when things were going along pretty well, then the Second Seminole War started and things became a little insecure. Houseman formed his own militia when he failed to get support from the federal or the territorial government to help defend the key against Indian attacks. The Seminoles were snooping around. He could see them on the other islands. And meanwhile, as Houseman's there, Henry Perrine, Jeff mentioned him previously, had been a consul in Mexico for the U.S. government. There in Mexico, he becomes obsessed with the healing power of plants, how plants could be used to do various things, heal illnesses, be used commercially to make rope, to make clothing, and he had his own dream of what we would now call economic botany. He wanted to set up a plantation with tropical plants, and he thought South Florida would be the perfect place for this. He filed for the federal government to have a land grant in what's now southeast, the tip of Florida, the Everglades, basically. He thought this would be perfect for a tropical botanical commercial enterprise. He could not get the grant approved. He thought, well, I'll take a step. I'll go to Indian Key and see if I could set up a base there and establish some plants on the nearby islands. He was warned not to because the outbreak of the Seminole War. he said, "Oh, I don't have anything to fear from them." And those were not his last words, but they could have been, because on the 7th of August, 1840, the dreams of Jacob Houseman, the dreams of Charles Howe, the dreams and the life of Henry Perrine ended when, in the early morning hours after midnight, the fourth character that we haven't heard about yet, Chakaika, and a fleet of Spanish Indians landed, beached themselves, landed on the shore of Indian Key and invaded it and burned the settlement, attacked it. Amazingly, there were only 6 casualties, one of whom was Henry Perrine, who was burned in his house. He lived in a 3-story house loaned to him by Charles Howe on the tip of the island. His family sought shelter in the turtle crawl beneath the floor, actually in the water. Henry Perrine, who spoke Spanish and heard the attackers speaking Spanish, thought he could placate them. He was wrong. He was killed. The house was burned. He was incinerated in the flames. The Indians had their way with what they needed to do. Some were Spanish, some were Seminoles, some were of mixed Spanish and Seminole heritage. They spent several hours on the island, burned it, took what they wanted from the store, took ammunition, took provisions, loaded up their canoes. It's now daybreak. A small naval base, very small naval base, about a mile north on Tea Table Key, became alerted to it. They loaded a cannon on a barge. The Indians on the shore of Indian Key commandeered the cannon that Houseman had set up for his defense. Indian Key was basically undefended. All the residents either hid in the water, got on their boats. They didn't defend themselves. The Indians overtook the cannon, took it to the beach, fired it at the little naval fleet on the neighboring island. They loaded their cannon on a little barge. They fired it at the Indian Key, and it was secured to the barge, and it launched itself into the water. So the Indians escaped pretty much scot-free. The island burned. The dreams were crushed. The Perrine family lived, but not Henry. Houseman abandoned Indian Key, went back to Key West, and there he tried to regain some kind of livelihood and was shortly thereafter squashed between 2 ships when he was hanging over the side, cleaning the maybe the barnacles off the side or painting, doing some repair. The 2 ships knocked together and crushed him. He was killed. His widow took him back to Indian Key and buried him. We'll see his burial location as we move forward. Chakaika was hunted down and was killed in his camp in the Everglades by Harney, Colonel Harney and his military force. And when they stormed into Chakaika's camp, they found a number of items that had come from Indian Key. Next slide, please. Here we have the map made by Henry Baker, whose praises I sung earlier. And the features that we see there that he identified by number are the same ones that we maintained in our project. I don't know how enlarged that is on your screen, if you can see that. But the warehouse is the 2 buildings that you see in the right center. They're labeled A and C, and that was one of our main areas of concentration. And then I'll show you later where we moved to in this kind of the center of the site, and then up to the Howe compound in the north. Henry was there in the early 1970s. As I said, he did an excellent job, produced a very slim report. But still, it was very important to us to have that report and his findings. Sort of discouraging, though, he didn't hold much hope for finding undisturbed, intact archaeological deposits. We were there at the invitation of the Florida Park Service. I like to work for the Park Service. Whenever they asked me to do a project for them, I said yes. They were very good sponsors for me. And the Park Service decided they wanted to stabilize several of the major features to improve the public interpretation of the site. Wisely, they knew they were going to need some archaeological work prior to the stabilization so that there could be recovery of artifacts, perhaps possibly outside chance of some intact deposits that would merit some archaeological recovery. So they asked me to go down there, which I did. I had worked in the Keys with the Carl Project on several different projects, but I'd never been to Indian Key. I'm going to tell you now the three major things we found in our project so that you can sort of keep them in mind as we move through the archaeological slides. Our job, as I saw it, was to make the artifacts as the primary means of interpretation, as a primary source of the history of Indian Key. We found three major findings. First, Indian Key was consistently occupied before and after Houseman. It became sort of a Houseman's Island, the existing interpretation by the park. And when you look at their management plan, Indian Key's management plan, it's heavily focused on Houseman. It was occupied before Houseman in the earlier 1830s and occupied all the way through the 1930s. 100 years worth of human occupation, not always heavy, but pretty much constant. Our second finding was it was not isolated. We might think of it now as remote. It's out in the ocean. There's no bridge. You can only use a boat to get there. It's tropical. It looks like a place we'd want to go hang out, in seclusion. But that's not the way it was when it was occupied during the 1800s or even in the 1900s. It was a thriving port of commerce. There were lots of goods that moved through there, not only through shipwrecks, but that were salvaged, which Houseman was very good at squirreling away and hiding in the warehouse. But just as a port of commerce for the increasing population in the Keys, in a way even rivaled Key West, which is much further to the south. The third thing was when you go to an island like that where the resources are very scarce, the natural resource is very scarce, and you build infrastructure, you'll see in a moment what I'm talking about. When you build solid buildings with foundations out of rock that are going to last a while and invest in an infrastructure, it's going to be reused over and over and over again by every subsequent settlement on the island. It's going to be reused, and in fact, we see consistent reuse as the island is reoccupied long after Houseman was put in his grave. So I'm thinking, I haven't really moved forward with this. I have to say with some shame, I never published on Indian Key. I had 4 very good graduate students do master's theses on our work there. And most of what I'm saying tonight is based on their theses. I never published on it. I don't think I've ever given a presentation on Indian Key before tonight. but it seemed to me like there's some contribution
Thank
to be
you
made.
a million times over.
Oh,
This is Marie. I was just saying
oh,
thank you a million times over that you are now presenting on.
oh, okay. I thought maybe I was done. Okay. So I'm thinking
Just getting started.
I'm thinking there's further contributions to be made to the theory of how people use islands, and that would challenge some of our preconceptions about the remoteness and the seclusion. Not that way at all in Indian Key. It was a thriving hub. I'm also thinking that public interpretation, both here and at many other places, even the Park Service, as conscientious as they are, I think tends to overemphasize one, even perhaps two, but usually just one sort of historical period that they've chosen for their parks, and that slights the most of the sort of the common people, the other people that live there, and that's what I call archaeology doing history between the lines of documented history. That's what archaeology is really good at, and I think that the Park Service hasn't availed themselves of that as much as they should have, as much as they could have, and that might be a theme in parks across the country, looking at the other people, the workers, the laborers, the enslaved people that made it all happen. And so I think those are the three things that I'm emphasizing in our talk as we move ahead. So let's have our next slide. We're going to get into the archaeology now. Oh, this was just a close-up, sorry, of the Henry Baker map showing the warehouse in the right center, A and C letters marking that. Our area of work is the rectangular, in addition to the warehouse, the rectangular F and G, which is in sort of the upper left center, and then in the far upper corner of the slide, the area of the Howe compound, which is what came to be what Henry called Area Q. Okay, next slide, please. All right, this is the warehouse as it appeared to us in 1998 when we first went to the site. We worked there from 1998 to 2002, mostly in the summers. I think we may have been there once in the wintertime. The summers there are incredibly hot and almost unbearable. But this is what we were confronted with. I had not been to the site before, and I'm thinking, all right, what do we do with this? It looks like just piles of rubble. But in the foreground is what Henry had labeled A, and then to the right side of the wall there is C, two compartments to the warehouse. And Henry suspected this, but we pretty much confirmed that they belonged to different time periods and served different purposes. So let's go with the next slide. I have to also say that most of the images have come from my student theses. My images, this was in 98 through 2002, were in slide form. This was pre-digital era. So I think I turned over the slides to BAR. I don't think I had them. Even if I did, making them into digital images would have been a huge task. So I just went through my student theses and lifted photos out of their work. I credit them at the end, so they're not, they get their credit. But here we see the floor of warehouse section C. You can see the bricks there, and the bricks were laid on top of coral bedrock that had been smoothed out and a layer of plaster put on the bedrock, and then the bricks laid in courses And what you see there are the scratch marks on the bricks in the lower right-hand corner of the image. The scratch marks were made so that the next layer of plaster would adhere tightly to the bricks. And so we had 3 layers of plaster, 3 layers over top of the brick. And the side walls, the plaster was continuous with the side walls, obviously functioned as a cistern to capture water. The fundamental challenge of living in the Florida Keys, other than the hurricanes, is fresh water. So almost every building, every little settlement, every homestead had a cistern. If you're going to have a large population like was planned for Indian Key, you needed large cisterns, large sources of rainwater that were captured. There was basically no fresh water. There are no springs. There are a few areas on the other island, close by islands, where the rainwater is captured, but there's no aquifer that comes up to provide well water. It's captured water through the use of cisterns. So what I'm saying here, what I think happened here, is when the Navy occupied the site in 1840, after the Houseman era concluded, they used bricks to rebuild what may have been a damaged floor of the burned warehouse. It burned in the Indian attack, and then put 3 layers of plaster on top of that to hold water. Now, we're going to look more about the controversy between plaster and mortar in a moment. Let's have the next slide. This is what the floor looked like when we finished. You can see that there were areas of the floor where the plaster on top of the brick had pretty much eroded away. So we cleaned that off, and it was just rubble, but we left the plaster where we could. So this is what the floor looked like when we finished on area C, compound C of the warehouse. You can see the coral block walls around it, on top of which a building would have been constructed. The building, of course, no longer exists, but these were made out of coral blocks that were cut out of the bedrock and formed up into block walls. And warehouse area A, which is to the left of the wall you see there on the left-hand side of the screen, was actually cut and chiseled by a stonemason into the bedrock. And there, an area A, which I think was the original warehouse and the original cistern, there was no brickwork on the floors, only a single layer of plaster to form the cistern there. Next image, please. This is the stabilized warehouse after the conservation preservation team from the University of Pennsylvania, who worked side by side with us in the last season of our work there, laid in gravel and did a conservation effort to keep the walls stabilized. So there you see to your left, area A of the warehouse, and to your right, area C. And what you see on area A to the left is the walls cut down into the bedrock by a stonemason. Next image, please. We did our best to use every shred, every potsherd, every fragment of archaeological evidence that we could to help build a story that was independent of documentary evidence as much as possible. So I'm showing here just one small part of a massive thesis done by my graduate student, Lisa Lamb, on the warehouse. And we tried, here you see our excavation areas in the dotted lines, Henry Baker's, his testing done in the solid lines. And Lisa did a mean ceramic dates, which you might not be able to see depending on how large your image is that you're actually seeing there. Attempting to see, she did the same thing for area A, attempting to see if anything made sense in terms of use and reuse of the two areas. Unfortunately, it was pretty well scrambled after all the work she did. The mean ceramics dates, the cross mending of hundreds of tiny sherds. We ended up saying, it's a mess. Henry was right. We're not going to be able to do anything with this except extract some maybe museum pieces if they ever do a eventual interpretation of the warehouse. So we were left basically with not much there that Henry didn't know about. We gave it our best shot. We put a lot of effort into it. Came out with nothing really conclusive, but with hundreds and hundreds of artifacts recovered beyond what Henry had done in his very preliminary work in the 70s. All that is tabulated in her thesis, which is up at BAR now. And so it forms a research document for somebody who's ever inspired to go back and look at all the types she identified that span the periods from 1830s up through the 1850s and even later. Okay, next image, please. This is Henry's map and our map, our GPS map overlaid on the aerial that you saw earlier to show the warehouse area A and C there, which you see to the right. The areas that we ended up focusing on more in the middle, G and F, and the Howe compound to the north side of the island, L, M, and Q, the Howe compound. Next image, please. Okay, here is the area, the feature called F, which you see there in the right center of the image, and G right next to it. Those were house lots, and the houses were fronting on 4th Street, which you see there, the squarish rectangle buildings that are taken from the 1830s historical map that we saw overlaid on our GPS map that we did much later. And you can see that feature F, where we did most of our work here, is actually behind the structure itself, the house structure, which was occupied by 2 women. We found out, we looked at from the historical documents, and apparently they had a household there. They did a lot of the laundry and sewing and stitching for the labor force that lived in the other houses in the community. Let's go to the next image, please. This is feature F, which again, the house that feature F would have served is to our left, off the screen to our left. And feature F is a cistern made out of coursed coral block. You can see the block there. And after a heavy rain, it still holds water. So it was a cistern, and it functioned. It had a building over top of it, which Henry surmised, but we confirmed, a building over top of it, which may have been the kitchen that serviced the residence to our left, the house that was to our left, of which we recovered no solid evidence. And we concentrated our efforts around the outside walls of the structure of the foundation, thinking that that's where things get tossed out. there had been an amateur digging around in the center of this feature and finding some pottery and so forth. We didn't go there. Our model suggested that, as we know in historical archaeology, things get tossed out back. They end up being deposited outside. So that's where we focused our efforts. You can see in the foreground the bedrock. See the coral bedrock right there? That's the uneven surface that was around the wall, and into which the waste, broken ceramics, the pots, some of the pans, the glass, the animal bones from the kitchen, the broken stove parts, etc., all ended up out in the backyard. The white gravel there is where you see the stabilization that occurred by the conservation team, which is why we conducted our excavation there. And let's move ahead, please. This is something we discovered beneath the surface as we did our excavation, perhaps a stoop, perhaps a step as a way into the back door of the structure that sat on top of the cistern, and the soil deposits all around there. You see the thickness between the coarse rock foundation of the stoop and where the orange stake is. That's midden deposit. All the way down to the bedrock was all midden. Very, very rich, very rich. And let's see the next image, please. So here we see the cistern area of F, the stoop coursed addition feature I just showed in the previous image, and its placement in relation to the vanished house structure fronting 4th Street, a domestic part of the site. Behind, in the background, you can see these large, tall, skinny plants. Those are sisal plants, hemp plants that are several generations removed, but are descended from the plants brought there by the deceased botanist Henry Perrine, who never lived to see his dream come true. Nonetheless, the plants that he brought to Indian Key flourished. And there was a tamarind tree just out of our picture to the right, which provided one of the only shade places in the whole island. And it was overtaken with these sisal plants. Okay. Next image, please. Again, another image of the same cistern feature, showing, this is taken to show the plastered interior walls. Obviously, the coursed rock itself would not have been watertight. And so that shows how the floor and the walls were plastered to function as a cistern. Next image, please. This is one of our excavation results showing a unit. This is a bird's eye view down against the wall. You can see the wall and the excavation in the right-hand side of the image. And we were very careful in our excavations to map in place everything we found. This is just one example that showed what we called mapped specimens. So we horizontally mapped and vertically shot in elevations for everything we found in place. So these things were laying horizontally on a surface. Clearly, we had an intact deposit, which we were ecstatic about. Having been discouraged by the warehouse and discouraged by Henry, that we were so happy to find intact archaeological deposits. That's the archaeologist's dream. So my dreams were becoming fulfilled there as we were mapping in individual map specimens and finding lots of glass and ceramics and pipes and metal and bottles, window glass, just many domestic types of objects that reflected the use and reuse of this structure through time. Next image, please. These are examples of some of the bottles that we found. Obviously, the intact bottles come from bottle collector guides. The little pieces of glass that you see there are what we found. The glass sherds, the glass fragments that we matched to identifiable specimens. Here we see cathedral pickle bottles, which date from 1855 to 1870. Clearly post-Houseman. We didn't find only one sherd, but many of these bottles. So again, evidence of reuse, reoccupation, people living there after the famed historically significant Houseman period. In the lower right hand, let's see, I think it's the next image. Can we see the next one? No, previous, please. Previous. Yes, that is a Army hospital bottle, U.S. Army hospital bottle, which dates from 1862 to 1865. So that dates to a period of probably 1875 use of the island as Camp Bell, which was established when Key West was experiencing a yellow fever epidemic, and sick people were moved up to Indian Key, and a hospital was formed there. Next image, please. And nothing says personal life, personal possession. Nothing's as personal as a toothbrush. And there we have a pretty well preserved bone toothbrush we found in those deposits outside the wall of feature F, and fragments of a bone comb. Next image, please. This, I'm thanking Marie for providing this. This is the BAR photograph of that same bone comb once it ended up there in their collections. A nice, fairly well preserved piece of personal possession there from the deposits. Helps tell the story about people that lived there. They brushed their teeth. The bristles, there's a few of them partially preserved, maybe from boar hair, something fairly rigid. These were animal hair bristles. And we used Barbara Maddox's dating scheme that she had published and written about some years before. Barbara, who worked at BAR or Historic Preservation Office, 1840 to 1850 is how she would have dated this toothbrush. Okay, next image, please. Again, up against that same wall, plates, ironstone plates in intact deposits. You see they're laying flat on a surface. Whenever an archaeologist finds something like that, you know you're dealing with a surface, because the sherds, the plate fragments, are not sticking up and down. They're laying down on something. They're laying flat. That had to be on a surface. And again, so excited to find these along the back wall. They had heavy knife marks, cut marks on the plates. They were heavily used. We dated these with a trademark on the back, J. Edwards, 1842 to 1851. We know from some of the fauna we recovered, we did not do a very detailed zooarchaeological analysis. We just didn't have the capacity to do that. But we did identify pig, cow, and chicken as domestic animals, but mostly, as you might suspect, fish and sea turtle were numerically the most dominant bones. We did not do any kind of biomass study or anything like that, but just a very broad analysis of species represented. So let's go on to the next image. Here you see that same plate, cross-mended and put back together. On the backside is the J. Edwards hallmark, dated by us 1852 to 1851. This image, oh, it happened before I asked for it. Thank you. Is another plate from the same area. You can see how we cross-mended it there. It came in separate pieces. That one says headwaters of the Juniata, Maker's Mark, 1831 to 1864. Stylistically, however, it probably dates to the latter decades of that range. That was based on a painting that was done by one of the famous landscape artists of the time, and then it was transferred to an engraving and then used as a decoration or a hallmark on these plates. Headwaters of the Juniata River is in Pennsylvania. This was a American-made ceramic found here at Indian Key. 35% of the ceramics were identified by us as teawares. 27% were plates. So again, heavy evidence of domestic use from multiple time periods. Next image, please. There we go. Pipes. These come from those same midden deposits outside the wall. Feature F, Peter Dorney pipes that had the imprint of the Dorney trademark, the Dorney patent. I'm not sure how well you can see that on the size of your image that you're looking at there. They are the most common identified pipe. They date around the 1850s. In the lower center, the bowl is a thistle and shamrock, which was, these ethnic types of pipe bowls became very popular to sell to the increasing ethnic populations coming over from the British Isles. The thistle and shamrock down there in the center. We had, from this deposit on the outside wall, 166 bowls and stems. So very, very rich. Next image, please. And faceted blue beads. Jeff, I know, will recognize these. Typical of the 1830s and beyond. It could be Seminole Indian, very common at Seminole Indian sites, and we know the Indian Seminoles were there. They came to trade at the store before the raid of 1840. They could have dropped when they were there raiding in 1840. They could be from some of the enslaved people. We know that these same beads were popular amongst the Black populations. Jeff may add something more about the beads, but we did find these beads. We did not find any other beads that I remember. No seed beads, no other beads that would be typical of the early 19th century indigenous trade types from those kind of sites. Only these blue beads. Next image, please. Here's a better image of what I was talking about before, the hospital bottle. You can see the little fragment that we were working with to identify it to a complete bottle. And most likely, as I said, came from the 1875 Canton Bell, not from the 1840 to 1842 Lieutenant John McLaughlin Navy occupation of the site, which occurred right after the Houseman period. Next image, please. as I said, we tried to not waste any type of archaeological evidence we could. So we mapped and gathered in the broken window glass, the flat glass from windows. Here you see a density map around that same F foundation. Clearly it had windows, and the one of the four theses was done exclusively on window glass, testing some of the formulas that were out there in the literature at the time that were attempting to use window glass as a dating means of dating historic sites, particularly 19th century sites. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, the idea being that the thicker the glass was, the more recent the site was. As the 19th century progressed, the glass became thicker. We didn't find conclusive evidence for that. Again, kind of like the warehouse thesis, the whole thesis was spent on finding that maybe the formulas didn't really work. We did have loose evidence. I'm not staking I'm not betting on it, that there were two periods of glass in evidence. One during the Haussmann era, and the other in the 1870s and later. The main date when we used the formulas for all the glass was 1853. Next image, please. Okay, now we're going to move away from F, which was so rich for us and so exciting to work in archaeologically. Again, this was a time period not well known. It was, I credit my students for finding comparative material to date and to analyze this material. You know, the colonial material, and I myself had pretty good experience working in Tidewater, Virginia, and Maryland in the British colonial sites for 2 years, and with some Seminole Indian sites, as Jeff mentioned in his introduction. But we're dealing here with something in the mid-19th century and later. At the time we were doing the project, not a lot of material out there. There had been some Civil War shipwrecks, some material, but it was kind of archaeologically unknown, archaeologically uninteresting to a lot of people. And so we were very, very gratified to be able to work in undisturbed deposits as we did in F. Then we moved up to area Q. So what you see there in the north end of the site, we're done with the warehouse. We're done with F and G. We're moving up to Q, which is the Charles Howe compound, Howe, H-O-W-E, who was one of the principals at Indian Key, along with Haussmann. And Howe also abandoned the site after its demise in 1840. His house, for some reason, was the only structure not burned. There's been lots of speculation about that. The Perrine house, which was owned by Howe, which was a substantial three-story structure, was burned to the ground, not a scrap remaining. It does not exist now as an archaeological deposit. There are scattered remains out in the water. The house was built over the water, not on a rock foundation. It didn't survive. Howe's house itself did, however. We don't know why the Indians favored it. They just ran out of interest, ran out of fuel. We don't know. But we also wanted to work in Q, even though there was not stabilization plans for it. Being the good archaeologist I was at the time, I stretched our funding to cover something that wasn't strictly part of the work plan. I wanted to find out more about what was going on up in this area, particularly because Henry thought, and we didn't think either, that it had been necessarily reoccupied. So I was hoping that we might find some intact 1830s deposits. So let's move up there, please, with the next slide. This is what we found, rubble on top of rubble. And there had been some rumors that treasure hunters had been out there in the 1950s and 1960s before the state got it with dynamite. They were dynamiting foundations looking for treasure. It goes without saying that in Florida, any time an archaeological site or any kind of abandoned site had treasure attributed to it, it was fair game for looting and vandalism on many scales, from shovels to bulldozers and dynamite. Anyway, this is what confronted us when we got up there. And so we were a little discouraged, but as it turns out, next image, please, we found intact deposits in this area, in the Howe compound area, that probably related to the kitchen. And we didn't find any interpretable, intelligible standing remains. It looked like, however, that the structure outside of which we excavated was not made of coursed block like the rest of the island buildings were, but was tabby. And those of you, I'm sure, familiar with historic Florida material know about tabby. This was a tabby construction, very different than the coursed block. But you saw before, when we looked at F, the bedrock and how pitted and pockmarked the eroded coral surface was. Well, we got very lucky. Once we cleared away some of the fallen rubble, we found lots of archaeological material artifacts, bone, shell, pipes, ceramics that had fallen down into these pockmarks in these crevices and had been covered up by soil and preserved. So they were intact, even though they weren't in a single stratigraphic unit. Each one of these little pockmarked areas with its own little unit was nicely preserved. Here's an example of some of the ceramics. I'm not showing you some of the rest of the artifacts we found for time purposes, but this is as many of you would recognize, the feather-edged ceramics, very typical of the 1830s. These are scalloped edges, hand-painted ceramics, clearly with embossed edge designs. You may be able to see that particularly in the grain. The grain shell-edged dates to this earlier period. We were pretty sure, for the most part, we were finding the Houseman period, the Howe period artifacts intact, saved by them being fallen down into these eroded pockmarks. Next image, please. And some of the pipes from the Howe compound area, most of which, you can see the one on the right, the face effigy. Most of these pipes dated to the earlier period. Next one, please. Here is a Dorney pipe, however, that came from that deposit, which is a little confusing. Either Dorney was earlier than we thought in some cases, or there was some use of this area after the Houseman era. Next one, please. Here we have Aunt Jane. We saw her much earlier. Here she is as an adult. I'm bringing her to your attention again because we see around her neck a brooch, a purple cut glass brooch, which you obviously can't see because it's black and white. However, now this is taken many years after she was a child in Indian Key. So the next image, please. The brooch we found intact, there you see it in the left-hand image below her picture at Indian Key, is nearly identical to the one she was wearing as an adult. So obviously it's not the same one since it was there later, but we figured it possibly belonged to one of the enslaved people. that lived with Aunt Jane. Again, remember that we had a significant enslaved population living there at Indian Key. I was hoping we'd find something that we could attribute to them. We did find some pottery that was earthenware, not the American made or the European imported, but more of an indigenous or what's called Kelowna ware type pottery here. I can't conclusively say it's Kelowna ware. There is a mostly now eroded and gone small Aboriginal midden on the north side of the island, not far from this, which may be how it got its name, Indian Key. There's no other Indian Key name was there long before the raid in 1840. So how it got named that, I'm not sure, unless it was just sort of a promotional public relations kind of thing to play up its exotic resort image that they were trying to entice people to come down to. There was a very small midden. Henry found a little bit of it when he was doing his work there. Most of it by the time we got there was gone. Those possible Kelowna ware ceramics came from there, came from the midden. Perhaps they were made or brought there by the enslaved populations. We don't know. But there you see the location of the brooch in relation to what you see there in pink are our test units and the rubble area further to the upper right-hand side in our grid system going down the street, 5th Street now, not 4th, which is where F and G were. This is on 5th Street, which led to the Howe compound. And the Perrine house had been over the water, just off the image to the upper right-hand side. Next image, please. Also, some evidence of children. We know that the Perrines had children. The Housemans didn't have children. The two women that I mentioned previously that had lived in F, there was at least one child that lived there. His name was James. He was actually killed he sought refuge in the attack in the warehouse, which burned, and the burning timbers fell on him. But this is a porcelain doll shoe, perhaps belonged to James, perhaps to the Howe daughters. We don't know, but it's clearly a child's doll we found in our work. This came from Henry, I think, and we found child's artifacts in our work as well. Next image, please. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about the naval occupation that was there in 1840 to 1842. We've kind of skipped around a little bit, but I'm bringing that up now because we have a discussion about the naval, what did the naval occupation, what was their architectural footprint that they left? McLaughlin, Lieutenant John McLaughlin, got himself in hot water because he stationed his naval operation there to go up and raid the Everglades, where they knew the hotbed of Indian resistance was by this time. McLaughlin commissioned some canoes, large canoes, in which he actually did cross the Everglades several times. I think the first non-native that we have record of that did that. He based himself in Indian Key. He rebuilt some of the structures. He built what he called a hospital. He built for himself what seems to have been a plush house. So plush, in fact, that the auditors questioned some of his expenses. So plush that one of his subordinates kind of blew the whistle on him and said, look, he's spending way out of proportion here. He's buying himself his fancy bottles of wine coming in, and furniture and upholstered couches and paintings and all these things coming into his house. He's a lieutenant naval commander. What's he doing? Well, the charges did not stand. And actually, the whistleblower ended up getting court-martialed for his trouble. So McLaughlin maybe was tarnished a little bit, but actually ended up unscathed by the allegations. He built a series of cisterns that were circular, not like these rectangular cisterns we'd seen before that were built originally in the Houseman period. These were circular, brick-lined cisterns. Here's one here showing the interior with the bricks exposed in the base, the plaster on the interior, the mortar holding the bricks together in the bottom, the circular pillar in the center, probably holding some kind of central beam for a structure over top of the cistern. Now, remember, with cisterns, they had to be covered. They had to have a roof over them, or a roof structured nearby with gutters that fed water into the cisterns. They were not open air. They didn't just capture rain as it was coming down. They concentrated the flow of rain coming off of roofs. And so it probably was a roof over this, perhaps even McLaughlin's house, as a speculation. We don't know for sure. But the cistern itself did not show up on the earlier maps, historical maps that we saw, these cisterns. There were several done by McLaughlin in the naval period to provide water for him and his men. And an example now of the way these cisterns operated would be if you ever get to the Gamble Plantation, maybe some of you have, the state park in Bradenton, where the cistern exists outside of the house. There's a gutter system coming off the metal roof that feeds into the cistern. It's exactly what would have happened at the Indian Key cisterns. But I'm showing this to you here because one of the four theses focused entirely on the architectural features of the site. And again, not trying to waste any fragment of archaeological evidence, we wanted to look at the plaster and the mortar. And there was chemical analysis done on the plaster and the mortar, and they should be chemically distinct. They're not the same thing. Plaster has lime, sand, fiber mixed in, and water. The fiber is generally some kind of hair, horse hair, some kind of animal hair. The final coat, however, did not have any fiber in it. The plaster, or the mortar, however, had Portland cement. That's what was in mortar. Now you may be thinking Portland cement comes much later. Not so. It was first produced in England in the early 1800s. It was imported. It was used quite widely in the United States, in territorial Florida, in the imported form. It was first manufactured in the United States here domestically in 1870. So it would not be unusual to find mortar in earlier pre-1870s foundations. But what we found here, oddly, not really explainable, is that the plaster and the mortar both had Portland cement in them. Unusually, because plaster shouldn't have Portland cement. What we did find was that in the different features, the Houseman era features versus the later naval features, the naval rebuild of feature C in the warehouse and in these cisterns, the mortar had what would be the sort of design strength mixture to give strong binding mortar, the right percentages of sand, water, and cement. The earlier mortar, which we had been calling plaster in the Houseman and the earlier periods, had a very high percentage of Portland cement and a low percentage of water, which would make it not as strong. So the idea being that perhaps the Navy people knew what to do. You know, they were constructing brick forts up and down the coast, you know, in Key West, in Pensacola, you know, along the coastal fortification system on the Atlantic. They were using brick. They were building. They had specifications they were adhering to. So most likely, we think, perhaps speculation, however, they were mixing up their mortar according to specifications. The earlier was more vernacular. Next image, please. Oh, I should have mentioned, we also studied the bricks. And we had another student who never materialized into a thesis, but did a pretty good study of bricks, trying to figure out if the sizes of bricks made any difference in terms of dating. Turns out, not really. It's hard to date bricks, which maybe is why archaeologists are not, at least at that time, not that interested in them. We did compare them with Fort Jefferson and anything else we could find that had descriptions of bricks. Not conclusively were we able to date them at all, but we do know that bricks were very typical of naval period construction, 1840s and later, not typical of Houseman era, which was the coarse coral block, and that bricks were being made domestically as close as Pensacola and were being shipped all over the place. So that's our brick study. What you see here in this image, in 2002, our last season, we actually did some laser scanning, and we did produce a number of laser scanned images, which to me, looking back, they all look very psychedelic. So I didn't want to show them to you and strain your eyeballs. And they weren't that informative, but they did produce good documentation of all the features. Here's the scanning unit that was used. I don't think there was any prior use of a laser scanner on an archaeological site in Florida. This was 2002. I could be wrong. I didn't find any evidence of that. So we did do some scanning there. Next image, please. In summation, here's what we found in terms of reuse of the site. The green areas are strictly, almost exclusively, the Houseman period. The Houseman Foundation, we didn't talk about it all. It was pretty much obliterated. It's still present in some areas where Houseman had his mansion, so to speak. The slave quarters I tried to look for outlying on the edges of the house, could not find any real evidence of them, just bedrock. Houseman's grave, as I said, his widow brought him back to his corpse, back to the key, and dug through the soil, which is now eroded away, dug maybe 1.5 feet into the bedrock, maybe not her, but a helper, dug down and put his corpse into the ground, entombed him at Indian Key. Somebody later vandalized the grave, skeleton was removed, a tombstone was removed. It had his name and dates on it. I think maybe there's a picture of it in the Florida Memory Collection. Anyway, we didn't talk much about that. It was outside of our purview for our work. Green areas, Houseman. The blue confirmed reoccupation warehouse we see there, F&G we see there. The naval period in yellow. The red, not sure, they were just rubble areas, didn't really date those or work much in them. So that's kind of our summary of what we found. Our conclusion: the reuse, reoccupation of Indian Key. We know it was occupied in the 20th century. Well, in the later 19th century, there was Camp Bell, which was the hospital. It was occupied by workers that were building the lighthouses at Alligator Reef, Carey's Fort Reef to the north, which put the wreckers out of business since the lighthouses alerted the ships to the location of the reefs. And there were several stages, several phases of those constructions. The workers lived on Indian Key, so they left some archaeological remains. Perhaps some of the glass we found dates to them. And in the 1900s, there were fishing families that lived there, fishing and sponging, turtling, eking out a living. There were two men that lived there in I think the 1940s, if I remember, both of whom were killed, were warned to get off the island because of a impending hurricane, warned but didn't, and drowned. One body was draped over one of the cisterns, the other was washed out to sea and recovered. But we found a rubber Tom McCann shoe sole, which may be one of theirs. Who knows? Last image, please. We did some public archaeology. There were some tour groups that came on occasion, and we did make our own signage, interpretive signs that we put around in case we were not working where the tours went. There were some boat guides that were leading the tours. I don't want to tell you what they said. It was 99% myth and less than 1% fact. They told some good stories about what took place out there to entertain the visitors. I didn't intrude or correct. I went about our business, and we put up our own signs, fact, evidence-based signs. Anyway, here's one of my grad students, Phyllis Kolianos, showing some artifacts to one of the tours. I'm going to suggest now anybody that wants to visit Indian Key should contact the park, because the dock that has been used over the years comes and goes with the storms. It wasn't always present every year we were there. There was a couple times we had to sort of beach ourselves and jump off. Then it was rebuilt, and then I think was dilapidated, removed in subsequent hurricanes. So I'm not exactly sure now what the status is. So check first to see if you can access the island. I hope you can. You can self-guide a walking tour. Those of you that have seen this presentation will have a much better idea of what's going on there. You will be able to see the foundations I just described, the road system, the town square, which Houseman intentionally constructed. I should have mentioned Houseman, coming from Staten Island, wanted to make sort of a New England style town plan that would appeal to people from the north. And this was very much a planned grid system that would resonate with order, with planning, that would provide some comfort to people thinking they weren't coming into the wilderness. One thing missing, however, was a church. No church. There was a hotel, had a billiard hall, a bowling alley that Audubon stayed in when he was there in 1832. In fact, it was so raucous in the room next to where he was trying to spend his evening working on his drawings that he couldn't concentrate. There was so much banging and dancing going on. He complained about it. Nonetheless, no church, which was unusual, but probably reflected Houseman's overwhelming commercial interest in developing the site. Next image, please. And thank you for your attention. Thank you, PAST, for hosting me. I need to thank the Florida Park Service. I did a number of projects for them over the years. This was one that they brought to me, and I have to thank their support, particularly Steve Martin, who worked for the Park Service then, a very forward-thinking, sort of visionary person who understood the value of archaeology in terms of Park Service interpretation, and Pat Wells, who was the park ranger there, who facilitated our access to the island. We had to use his boats to get out there and back every day, sometimes in less than favorable weather. I didn't want to miss a single field day. So we went out there sometimes when the sky was black to the east, out to the ocean. And we worked anyway as much as we could. So sometimes storm waves were rolling in, and he didn't hesitate to take us out there. The Friends of Isla Morada Area State Parks pitched in with some funding as well to supplement what the Park Service was providing. My grad students, Lori Collins, Lisa Lamb, Kelly Driscoll, Alexis Sykes, who authored the 4 theses I mentioned. Field crews, in addition to the grad students, Chris Bell, Tony Carrier, Mary Beth Fitz, Phyllis Kolianis, and Jill Clay. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Brent, I cannot thank you enough. This is a dream come true for me. This was to let my past members know. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person tonight. As you've probably been explained to you, I've been out of town, and I came back and gave COVID to all of my family members, which I'm sick about. But anyway, this absolutely was a dream come true. And I see that Steve Martin is joining us tonight.
Oh, Steve.
Yeah.
Were you there for the whole presentation, Steve?
He has been. He has been.
Well, it's so good to know you were. I hope I did justice to our work there and the collaboration that we had with the Park Service. So,
yeah, thank you, Brent. Your involvement there was a real turning point in getting better understanding by the local public about the importance of Indian Key, because it's, again, another one of those examples of best kept secrets. So it brought the interest of the Friends of Indian Key and the general parks system down there more involved. And I think the National Park Service Historic Preservation Training Center also did some work to stabilize some of the ruins down there, but we wanted to get the archaeology done first before crews got in there to do some stabilization work. So it was very critical of your involvement. And of course, you mentioned Henry Baker, who was a very active, removed guiding light in the whole process. So it was great teamwork. Thanks for the presentation.
I emphasize the teamwork. We wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for Henry. We wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for Steve. And it was teamwork all the way. So, and the students, of course. But yes, thank you all.
Thank you so much.
And I have to say that I am very, very proud to be the collections manager that manages these extremely important collections from Henry Baker and from the work that Brent has done. And again, a dream come true for me. And I would hope one day to be able to provide a tour for our past members of artifacts that these gentlemen have curated from these collections. And I wrote a couple of notes before I turn it over to past if they have any questions. First of all, thank you for not digging up the bricks from the floor of the warehouse and sending them to be our collections. I'm extremely grateful for that.
Yeah, you would need a whole nother building for that.
And to me, as a collections manager and an archaeologist, that you were able, and well, I guess your graduate students and you were able to figure out from a tiny little piece of a bottle, the entire bottle. So to us as archaeologists, the bottle so much, the intact bottle is awesome, but to find a little tiny piece of it and to figure out where it came from is mind-blowing and phenomenal. And so kudos to your students. And Brent, before I turn it over to anybody else who has questions, Guy has spent the last 3.5 years of his retirement writing up Andersonville. And if you have not written anything, and turn it over just to your students, please write something about this amazing place and the archaeology there.
Yeah. Well, I will say that I tried. I probably drafted 3 or 4 attempts, and I just couldn't, as Jeff said in his intro, I've written quite a bit, published, a number of things on different sites and different projects. And so it's not that I can't or won't or don't write. I just couldn't find the angle to get in, to, and it was just my shortcoming in not being able to do that.
Oh no, he's muted. I think your mic is muted, Brent.
Oh,
Oh, almost. Click it one more time. There we go.
so I couldn't find the right angle to approach writing it. I thought maybe I would focus on the unexpected story that archaeology tells about sites that are historically evident or well known. George Washington's making the news now with things they've been finding there, and our own version here in Florida, the archaeology of Indian Key, how it differs and tells a different story. As I said, the story between the lines of written history. I kind of thought about that as an approach, but I just couldn't quite nail it. So I haven't done it. Maybe I will. Guy is an inspiration, I guess, if it's taken him this long. But we'll see. We'll see.
Okay, does anybody in the past audience, I'm sorry, I hogged up everything. I know this has run a little later than most meetings, and my apologies for that, because again, self-indulgence. But does anybody present at the meeting at Goodwood have any questions for Brent?
Yeah, we had a question. What else do you think should be done with the site?
Well, I haven't been there in a long time, so I don't know what actually was done with it. I think that based on our work, based on the recommendations that we've made in the student theses, based on our interim reports that we provided to the state, there's much improved interpretive work that could be done. The signage there, when we were there, was minimal and really not informative, not nearly to the level that would provide information, which I think is why the tour guides were kind of free to tell the stories that they wanted to, because there wasn't anything that was going to contradict them. So the on-site interpretation could be greatly improved. I think that on the highway itself, before you cross the bridge over Indian Key Pass, there is a historical marker. I think it's on the left-hand side, if I remember, a little pullover. There could be an improved sign there that actually had photographs of artifacts and things that made the site come to life a little bit more than it has. And perhaps some on mainland site, a little interpretive center. I know there used to be things at Ligman Vita Key. Again, that's hard to get to and not that accessible. Something that would bring the visitor closer and more in touch with the site. So it's not like Steve said, one of the best kept secrets. So those are some things that could be done. Stabilization that's been done is probably what can be done. There might be some vegetation that's removed from around some of the other foundations, carefully removed. Some of that actually is a cultural landscape, as I mentioned. There's the tamarind trees and the sisal plants, some other things that are descended from what Perrine brought there that are not indigenous to the island. So you have to be careful, but I'm sure the Park Service would be careful with that. So there could just be maintenance like that. Better placement of signs, a better introduction when you get off the boat to the way the wharf, the dock is set up for the boat access. You approach it by walking across the town square and heading in the direction of the warehouse. There could be something more of an interpretive panel right there that showed the layout of the island, so you know where you were going and where the streets were. Some basic, like you see at many other state parks or national parks, some basic orientation kiosk right there. Now, of course, there's a concern with vandalism. It's not, it's not visited every day or even frequently, but I don't know if that's an ongoing concern now that it is state property and it is visited occasionally. I don't know if vandalism is an ongoing threat or not, but those are some things that could happen.
Perfect, thank you.
Brent, in 2001, the French group published a very good interpretive guidebook all about Indian Key. It's about 100 pages long.
Oh.
Is still available.
Oh, okay.
In fact, the author is in the audience.
Who is that?
Tasha Weinstein.
I know.
Okay. Well, that's good. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
If it was published in 2001, it wouldn't have taken advantage of the student theses, which were very detailed. But,
I'm really interested to read those. So I hope they're online.
But I'm sure it is an improvement over. There really hadn't been anything prior to that I was aware of. Jerry Wilkinson has done, the local historian down there, had done a lot of research on Indian Key and the other islands too. So he's a good basis. I'm sorry I did not know of the 2001 publication.
Oh, that's okay. I'm happy to send you one. You're credited in it all over the place.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, I'm sorry.
Okay,
I
think as I said, I am not there, but I think that my board is probably ready to murder me.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
This has been extremely well received, and
Okay.
I will say if anybody has any additional questions, you can contact me via our website, past-tallahassee.org, and I can forward those to Brent. And this video has been recorded. Presentation has been recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel. But I'm going to go ahead and end this for mercy of my board. But
Thanks so much,
you so incredibly much. This has been fabulous. It's a dream of mine come true to hear your presentation about this. Rudy Westerman says, thank you, Dr.
Oh,
Weisman.
I see Rudy. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Hi, Rudy. Hope you're doing well.
Yeah.
Doing well, thank you.
Good Very good.
This is awesome.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Comfortably at home, I can see.
Yeah.
Very good.
And so my apologies, but we're gonna cut it off at this because yeah, Goodwood is a wonderful host, but
yeah,
they like us to get out of there, but at a
yeah, sure. And Jeff, thanks. Jeff, thank you. It was good to hear from you.
Right.
I can put you two in touch via email. That's a thing.
Well, I'm not that much of an emailer.
Yes, you are. Don't say that.
Well,
you've been very good about emailing me.
Well,
stop it. Stop it.
Okay.
Right now. Okay.
All right. Okay. We'll thank you. See you later.
Thank
Good night.
you
Good night,
so
everyone.
very much, everybody.
Good
Take
night.
care. See you next.